So like I would put part of my identity as I've experienced significant trauma as a domestic violence survivor. And it doesn't define who I am, but it does influence the way that I move through the world, right? Part of my identity comes from my cultural beliefs, right? Like my mom is an immigrant, and there's cultural beliefs that I have as a result of having an immigrant parent. So identity is everything that is abstract that we feel but can't necessarily like put our finger on and physically touch.
You're listening to Connect and Create a Life You Love with Charlotte Goodwin. Well, welcome everyone to another episode of Connect and Create a Life You Love podcast. And I'm so excited because after several weeks without having any guests on, today with us we have Kelly. And Kelly is a licensed clinical social worker, an EMT, so an emergency technician. She's also a certified personal trainer and a certified nutritional coach. So a wealth of knowledge and experience from Kelly. I'm super excited to have this conversation with her. So welcome, Kelly. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get started. We had a bit of time to chat before we started recording, and I think what you're doing and what you're all about is amazing, and I can't wait to share it with everyone. So do you want to give us kind of a quick or not quick, whatever you like, kind of overview of, your story, your past, what that led you to be doing now and why?
Sure. So as you said, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm based actually in Connecticut, and I own a private therapy practice called Turning Point Wellness. And I specialize in working with EMS professionals on post-traumatic stress injuries. However, I also work with members of the general public and really do a lot of work with women on understanding and reclaiming their identity after trauma and traumatic experiences. This was really born out of my own trauma and really taking a hard look at the way that trauma impacts how we move through the world and the way that we define who we believe we are. So I'm divorced. I'm a single mom to an amazing 8.5-year-old girl who is just a powerhouse of all of the things. And I left her dad when she was a year and a half old. He and I were together for just shy of 10 years. And the entire relationship was abusive. Before I talk about what the relationship was like, I do want to say, out of credit to him, he and I are actually in a very good place at this point in our relationship. We co-parent very well, and we have, in the last 7 or so years, we have done an extraordinary amount of work on our relationship so that we could be in a good place and parent our daughter in as healthy of a way as possible. So that being said, the entire relationship was abusive from the get-go. The quick, like the Polaroid version of it, was that I experienced significant financial abuse, gaslighting, so mental and emotional abuse. There were sexual components to the abuse, and it escalated to a serious threat of violence, which ultimately is the thing that prompted me to leave. When as far as the financial abuse goes, I was not allowed to have access to our checkbooks. I was not allowed to have access to our banking accounts. He controlled all of the money. So I rarely knew what we actually had. And I just assumed, out of my own naivety, that things were handled and fine, and bills were getting paid and all of that. He would make extraordinary purchases without discussing it with me prior. As a team should be discussing large things, and I would be ridiculed if I wanted to buy something.
Mm.
When it comes to the gaslighting, so gaslighting is for those who don't know what gaslighting is a pattern of mental and emotional abuse that ultimately makes a person break down so much over an extended period of time that they begin to question their own reality. At the height of the gaslighting, I was in my late 20s, early 30s, and I actually thought that I was having an early onset of dementia. I literally thought I
Oh,
was losing my
goodness.
mind. He would say to me that he had told me something was going to happen, that he had made plans with friends or something like that, just to use that as an example. And he would be out with people, which was fine. Like everybody has a right to a social life. And he didn't have to ask me permission to go anywhere. I wasn't looking for those kinds of things. Um, and then would come home and I would question him, where were you? And he would accuse me of forgetting. And I was constantly being told, well, Kelly, you have the worst memory. I tell you these things and you just can't retain it. You're crazy.
Oh my gosh.
He would move things around in the house and then tell me that I had done it and didn't remember doing it. Uh, and over time, there was more to it than just that, but over time, those were the types of things that were happening as far as the gaslighting behavior goes, that led to me thinking, God, there really must be something wrong with me.
Mm.
Uh, he very subtly and slowly over a period of years isolated me from friends and family, to the point of me moving to the other side of the state with him, away from my family.
Mm.
I lost friendships that to this day I've not been able to recover. Um, there was in terms of the sexual abuse, there was inappropriate touching where I would constantly say to him, I don't want to be touched like that. Don't touch me. I'm not comfortable with this. I feel like a thing and not a person when
Mm.
you touch me in this way. And he would look at me and say, you're my wife. I can do what I want.
Oh.
Uh, and then the threat of physical violence happened in the last, really, I'd say 6 months of the relationship. There were several incidents where he had, I'll call it, postured towards me. He never hit me, so there was never actual physical violence that happened. It was simply the threat of violence. Um, but in the final incident, he was intoxicated and had grabbed a knife out of the kitchen knife block and threatened to harm himself, and then immediately spun around and said, nope, I should just slit your throat instead. Then I would be out of my misery of having to be married to you. Um, that incident lasted for about 2.5 hours. He had thrown things at me during that incident, and I disclosed finally to my parents after that incident was over, and we planned for 6 weeks. And ultimately, he had gone to work one night, and I fled with my daughter.
Mm.
Um, I ended up hiding for 3 days with a family member, and I fled on a Friday night. The following Monday morning, I was in an attorney's office filing for a protective order. The entire divorce took about 6 months. Um, I lived with my folks during that time. So, one of the things that I also want to emphasize is that I was able to get out with the ease that I got out with,
Mm.
because I had resources
Mm.
within my family, and not everybody has that. However, there are always resources that we can get access to. So even if you are in a situation such as what I was in, and you don't have access to friends or family, there are still resources. Um, so uh, I lived with my folks for 6 months while the divorce was going on, and then a few months afterwards, just to financially finish the process of getting back on my feet, and moved out at that point with my daughter and haven't looked back.
Great. So happy that you're out and safe and thriving now.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So this is where you said from that divorce and that trauma and that experience that, has kind of developed you and what you used to have. We're talking about the Unapology Project, right?
So I had opened up a business called the Unapology Project, and unfortunately, just because of how things develop and the things that we have to decide on as business owners, I've since closed the Unapology Project, and I'm providing all of my services at this point under Turning Point Wellness. However, the Unapology Project was born out of this desire to look at women and say, you can go through all of these things. You can, or different things, and experience trauma. And you can have trauma, but you don't have to be defined by trauma.
Mm.
You can experience negative things in your life, but that doesn't have to be the thing that defines who you are and the way that you move through the world. You can say, yeah, I have this, but I also have all of these other things too. And I have this, but I am not this.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a very distinct difference between the two.
Yeah.
In one respect, I would say that I am who I am today as a result of the experiences that I've had, but I am who I am today as a result of the meaning that I've chosen to make of my experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Trauma can cause us to shrink,
Mm.
or it can cause us to expand, but we get to decide what direction we're going to move in with that.
Yeah. And now, can you just talk a little bit about trauma? I think for a lot of people, maybe when you hear trauma, you think it's huge events, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like abuse or something. And does trauma always have to mean that?
It doesn't. It doesn't. So trauma can be, in the therapy world, we call it big T and little T trauma. So big T trauma is the big stuff, right? It's the stuff that when we think of trauma, that's typically where our brains go to, of that, like major incidents in domestic violence, major world events, such as what we're seeing play out in the world today. Trauma can be these huge, massive things, but trauma can also be somebody accusing you of having a bad memory. Trauma could be watching I had a client at one point who was abused as a child and would just go into this other place when she watched a tree blow outside my office window, because it reminded her of where she was when she was being abused as a child. That's a big T trauma that started that process. But every time she watched this particular tree blow outside of my office, like just blow in the wind, it was a little T trauma because of the reminder.
Yeah.
Little T trauma could be you slice your finger when you're making food for dinner or cooking your dinner, and it's something that then makes you anxious about picking up a knife to cook again.
Mm-hmm.
So little T trauma can be those small, like microscopic moments that add up over a really long period of time.
Yeah. And what you say, or lots of things going on. I think different generations too plays in this, but
Mm-hmm.
some people think, oh, you're being too sensitive. And they're trying to minimize perhaps the trauma that someone else is feeling because
Sure.
it's not a big trauma. What's your view? What do you say to that?
I have a lot of things to say to that.
Go for it.
Certainly there's going to be generational differences, and there's ideologies that come out of every single generation based on the experiences that we have. The most important thing that we can do when we experience those types of things, of somebody saying, oh, well, you're too sensitive, or don't take it so seriously, it's not that
Or
big of a deal.
you're a snowflake, all these snowflakes.
Yep.
Too, right?
Yep, absolutely. Set boundaries. The things that I say to folks at this point, if I'm getting that kind of feedback, is, well, I can certainly see what would make you say that and what would lead you to feel the way that you feel. However, this is how I feel in this moment. Please respect it, even if you disagree with it.
Love that.
Right? So, like, there's we're going to encounter people and have moments with folks that we care about, especially, where we're going to have to agree to disagree, because we're just different humans with different beliefs and viewpoints and ideas, and that is okay. But what's not okay is treating each other disrespectfully,
Yeah.
or minimizing each other's emotions or experiences. And that's where boundaries really need to come into play. You're never going to be wrong for setting a boundary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, love that. Yeah, because I feel like personally, I'm someone who's very sensitive, so I can empathize with everyone, and
Sure.
um, so yeah. Then with other people, it's like, oh, it's going too far. It's like,
Yeah,
okay, you don't know how that person is feeling, right? So,
exactly.
and then
Yeah.
the other thing is, to have the confidence to voice your boundary and your
For
feeling.
sure. Yeah. I think the biggest thing that I would say to anybody when it comes to feeling scared about setting a boundary and standing up for yourself is that self-advocacy and taking up space in this world are two of the most important things that any of us could do. And if I think about it from a woman's perspective, especially as a woman,
Yes.
we are told to shrink. We are
Mhm.
told to be heard less. And women today are not doing that. We are claiming the space in this world that we are able to take up.
Mhm.
And we need even more of that. But that means that we're going to have to practice more self-advocacy, use our voices more in order to take up that space. And that's going to come from setting those boundaries and not being conflict avoidant.
Yes. Oh my gosh, yes. I was someone who avoided conflict for a very long time.
Me too.
Uh, oh my gosh. But it kind of eats you up because you just keep swallowing your words and it
For
just
sure.
piles up. But
Yeah.
yeah. So what are some tips for someone who is still maybe in that place where they're still not quite voicing things? How do you overcome that?
So find somebody who you do feel safe with and ask them if they're comfortable with you practicing that with them.
Mm,
Right. The best thing that we can do is identify people who we are already safe with in our worlds and in our lives, and say, hey, I'm recognizing that I have this particular deficit because of, and I want to practice it. I trust you. I feel safe with you. Can I practice this with you, please? And they're either going to invite you into that or they're not, and that's okay either way. But that's a great place to start, of really just being able to feel like you're on solid footing, at least with somebody, and then progressively being able to take more and more risks in how you set those boundaries with people that maybe you don't feel as safe with. But
mhm.
the people that we don't feel as safe with, those are usually the folks that we need to set the most boundaries with.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, some practice. That's great. So trauma, so people have undergone either big trauma or little trauma, or any obstacles in their life. And, if they no longer want to live in that story or in that experience, you have some like concrete steps for them to start taking to get out of it and overcome it.
Yes. So the first thing that I have most of my folks do is a exercise called roles, labels, and identity.
Roles, labels, and identity. Okay.
Yes. So we tend to, when somebody says to us, well, but who are you? We tend to define ourselves according to the roles that we play in our life.
Mhm.
While there's roles that are extraordinarily important, like the role of being a mother to me is the number one role that I have in my life.
Mhm.
The thing to remember with roles is that regardless of how important they are to you, they are only ever something that you do. You do them the way that you do them because of who you are in your identity. They're distinctly different things,
Okay, can
right?
you repeat that? So the roles.
Roles are only ever something that you do,
Mhm.
but you do them the way that you do them because of who you are,
Wow. It's
right?
the first time I've ever heard that like that. And wow. Yes.
Yeah. So if you think about it, so that usually the example I give to my clients is that I don't define myself as a deeply religious person, but I do define myself as a deeply spiritual person.
Mhm.
My spiritual beliefs very significantly influence how I mother my daughter.
Mm.
If my belief systems were different, like if I were a very religious person or if I were not religious or spiritual at all, there's no wrong answer, but that would then also significantly influence how I show up to the act of mothering. Right?
Yeah.
So who we are defines the way that we show up to being in our roles. Who I am as a woman, as a person, significantly influences the way that I show up to the role of being a therapist.
Mm.
So roles are only ever something that we do. Labels are the ways that the world describes how the world perceives us, right? And sometimes labels are accurate. If there's a part of your identity that you're comfortable with showing to the world is probably going to describe you that way. But if there's other ways that the world maybe misinterprets who you are, they may label you incorrectly, but that's still a label.
And then
Then
sometimes hearing that label over and over
you can internalize it.
and that would affect your identity.
Correct. Yeah. And so that's where therapy and coaching then come into play to kind of pull those things apart to really look at, are there things going on in your identity that maybe actually don't belong there because it's not actually who you are, but you've internalized it because you've heard it so many times.
Oh, yes.
Right. So I joke with my clients that I'm a very stubborn human being. I am extraordinarily stubborn. But I'm also labeled as stubborn because I'm comfortable with the world seeing that about me. Right. So I'm labeled that way. And I also am that. But if somebody were to describe me as maybe a not very nice person, I don't think that that's true about me. I could be labeled that way, but I don't have to believe that that's accurate information because that's simply how somebody experienced me in that particular moment and what they chose to believe was true.
So how do you not internalize labels that you don't agree with?
By having a strong sense of identity.
Okay, you're getting there.
So the last section of this exercise, so again, roles, labels, and identity. So when we talk about identity is everything that's left over once we're done filling out the roles and labels sections. So identity is our morals, our values, our belief systems. It is our life experiences that have influenced why we are the way that we are, right? So like I would put part of my identity as I've experienced significant trauma as a domestic violence survivor. And it doesn't define who I am, but it does influence the way that I move through the world, right? Part of my identity comes from my cultural beliefs, right? Like my mom is an immigrant, and there's cultural beliefs that I have as a result of having an immigrant parent. So identity is everything that is abstract that we feel but can't necessarily like put our finger on and physically touch.
Okay. Okay. This is so interesting. I love it. I've never had anyone, explain it in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes so much sense.
Yeah. It can get it can be as simplified or as complicated as you want it to be. This is the kind of stuff that I could talk for hours about, where like then we could go into cognitive dissonance and we could talk about distortions and all of these fancy flowery therapy terms that really are as simple as, what do you want to decide is real? Right? What do you want to decide is your story and what you're choosing to believe is true for you? Let's live according to that. Right.
So something that I love talking about is, creating a life that you love, right?
Sure.
So it basically is creating the story of who you want to be instead of maybe where you've come from, what you've been through, where you are now, but your future story, your future you. So that's what you're talking about, right?
Exactly. When we have something So the thing that people can really struggle with when it comes to creating the story that you love and the one that you want to live according to,
Mhm.
people can, if I talk about cognitive dissonance for a moment, cognitive dissonance is the friction between what we want to believe versus what's true
Okay.
and what we see actually happening, right? They don't mesh or line up very well. And this is where it starts to feel like friction, almost like sandpaper
Okay.
internally.
And like it's a lie.
And what's up?
Like it's a lie.
Yeah, yeah. And it makes us question what we're believing, right?
Okay. Like, oh, this is too far fetched. I can never achieve this. Those kinds of things.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So when we talk about cognitive dissonance is one of the biggest things to unpack in the process of creating the story that we want to live according to, right? It's like us questioning like the conspiracy theories of the world, right? Conspiracy theories create cognitive dissonance because it makes us question, well, is this real? Am I really living according to what I said? I'm not sure, right?
Mhm.
If you have the, I'm not sure about this kind of feeling, there's probably some cognitive dissonance going on.
Okay.
When we start to look at identity and creating stories that we want to live according to, addressing cognitive dissonance and allowing for the discomfort that it creates is an incredibly important part of that process, because that's where we get to say, okay, now I'm learning how to be uncomfortable in a tolerable and manageable way when I encounter stories that don't mesh with what I am choosing to believe is real for me, and continue on in spite of that discomfort.
Mm.
When the discomfort becomes so great that it stops us in our tracks, that's where we start experiencing, misalignment, feeling like we're being inauthentic, and that's where people really get themselves into some hot water and feeling like, God, where am I going with my life, and what am I doing in the world?
Yes.
So being able to unpack those things and really look at, this is what I'm choosing to believe is true for me. These are the morals and ideologies that I'm choosing to live according to. And people don't have to agree with me in order for this to still be important to me, right? Like those are the things to really spend time looking at.
Mm. Great. And so is that what you're sharing in your journaling download?
Yes. So on my website, you can go to my website, which is www.turningpointwellnessllc.com. And on there, under classes and consultation, you can download an ebook that I've written called Vision. And that's where we unpack, what is your story that you've been living according to? And are you good with it? Like, are you okay with what's there? And we address cognitive dissonance in there. We address, thought distortions, which is kind of like when you go to a carnival and you go to the fun house and you look in those weird mirrors and it's like,
Yes.
this is not what I look like. This is weird. That's what a cognitive distortion is. It's a thought that doesn't really match with reality. So being able to look at those things, my ebook Vision walks you through that process to really unpack, where are you at right now versus where do you want to go? What do you
Mm.
want your story to be? And I walk you through the process of rewriting your story.
Awesome. I love that. Love that. Okay. So some simple steps to start living healthier and prioritizing yourself. Can you give some
Yes,
simple
I
steps?
love this. So within this, I talk about the 5 Bs of self-care. So the 5 Bs of self-care are your brain, your body, your beliefs, your bonds, and your behaviors. And I encourage people to think of it as a table. So behaviors is the tabletop that ties the legs together, right? Because there's going to be behaviors in all of the previous 4 categories. So in your brain, your body, your bonds, and your beliefs, those are the legs. When we talk about your brain, Your brain is, it is, I mean, as a therapist, I think it's the most important organ we have, but your brain is something that needs constant stimulation. So I really encourage all of my clients to engage in brain-based self-care through reading, whatever you enjoy, but something that stimulates your thought process. But reading, journaling, things like that, that really get your mind going and thinking about, what do I enjoy? What feels good to me? Things like that. When we talk about your body, like, this is the basics that everybody,
Yeah.
like, we get railed at all the time about our body, and take good care of yourselves. So the basics of physical self-care are sleep, hydration, nutrition, and exercise. One of the things that I like for all of my clients and people that I speak with to know is that studies have shown actually that 30 minutes of cardiovascular exercise 3 days a week is comparable to a low dose antidepressant.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Wow. I've never heard of that before.
Yeah. And studies have shown that exercise hits slower than an antidepressant does, but the effect of it actually lasts far longer than an antidepressant does. So exercise really is something that has a significant impact on our mood. The other thing, when it comes to hydration, that's important to know. If you're even just slightly dehydrated, your frontal lobe, which is the area of your brain right behind your forehead, your frontal lobe controls all of our logical linear thought. So
Yes.
when you're trying to think rationally, that's your frontal lobe at work. If you are even just slightly dehydrated, your frontal lobe will function at 3% less capacity.
Oh, wow.
So when you're taking physical care of yourself through sleep, hydration, nutrition, and exercise, you're affecting the way that your brain works for the better. So your brain needs stimulating activities through reading and journaling. Your body needs some good self-care. Then there's our belief systems, this is if you are spiritual or religious, or neither. But, again, I personally don't feel that there's any wrong answer. Just do what feels good for you. But your belief system is really just simply about attending to those things, right? Like for me, I practice regular smudging. I meditate on a regular basis. These are all part of my spiritual beliefs. Um, and then bonds is all about our relationships, right? So this is about how you show up to your relationships to tend to the people who are most important to you, including yourself, right? Because as much as we think about relationships being with others, we also have a relationship with ourselves that needs just as much as attention as the relationships that we have with other people. And then again, the behaviors is the tabletop to the four legs. It's how we tie everything together.
And how we deal with the four legs also affects our behaviors, right?
100%. Absolutely.
Wow, that was amazing, Kelly. Thank you so much. This is like so packed, this episode. I love it. Any final things that you want to share?
Yeah. So I just take really good care of yourselves and be unapologetic in how you move through the world, right? Like, people don't have to believe the same things as you in order for your stuff to still be just as valid as anybody else's, and just as important and as impactful as anybody else's beliefs or stories. Your story is the thing that makes you who you are, and own it. Take up space because of it.
Awesome. That's what I used to tell my partner. I would tell him how I was feeling sometimes. Like, I don't know why you feel like that. I said, I don't know either, but I do, and I can't change it right now. So this is what it is.
So just honor it, right?
Yes. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Kelly. So if people want that journal vision download, www.turningpointwellnessllc.com.
Correct.
Awesome. And they can find all things about you and what you're offering there. And again, thank you so much. This was a great conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Now remember, you are beautiful and brave, smart and intelligent. You're caring, you're giving, and great at receiving. You're abundant, you are fun, you are at peace. You are you, and you are enough. Now go and create that amazing life that you love.